When the internet began, bulletin board services, or BBS, became the first online communities of the so-called information superhighway. Using their phone lines, people logged in from all over America to talk about sports, games, movies, and on one BBS in particular, share their ghost stories. Over time, those communities all went dark, except for one lone server that continues to operate somewhere in an unknown part of Pennsylvania's Rust Belt. A relic of the 1990s, veiled in mystery, it is a digital archive of humanity's strangest encounters with the unknown, as told by the people who experienced them. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Fear Daily.
Subject: The Witch House. User: ProC3T. Posted April 13th, 1997.
Right from the jump, I told Lowell we shouldn't fuck with the witch house. Everyone who grew up here knows there are houses you rob and houses you don't. Old Lady Kursov's house, with its turret roof and deep-set windows like sunken eyes, has always been one you left alone. I tried to explain this to Lowell when he brought it up over beers at the old post. In return, he called me a lame-brain Okie hick who still believed in fairy tales. Well, now he's dead, so which of us was the lame brain, Lowell? I went along with it, sure, but the knack told me to hang back when Bozo was jimmying the door, and it's the only reason I'm still alive. I've been stealing since I was old enough to want things other people had, 35 years and counting. Most people who do what I do for this long get pinched a few times. It becomes a part of the cost of doing business. Not me. Apart from a night in the drunk tank back in my 20s, the closest I've come to the cop shop is watching Police Academy, and it's all down to the knack. Think of it as a sixth sense, telling me which jobs are copacetic and which are hinky. The witch house? That place was all the way hinky, starting with Old Lady Kursov. My parents called her that as far back as I remember. The rumor mill liked to say she was an immortal witch, living in an enchanted house full of rubies and emeralds collected from hundreds, if not thousands of years of living. It always sounded like the kind of conspiracy bullshit you'd hear on that radio show Area 51, except for the fact Old Lady Kursov didn't seem to get any older. The year we tried to rob her house, her shoulder-length hair was the same bright white it had been since I was collecting baseball cards, the lines on her face exactly as deep as they'd ever been. No more, no less. Lowell must have heard the stories about jewelry and taken it from there. We'd been working together for 6 months or so, breaking into houses, stealing cars, the usual jobs. Lowell wasn't a clever guy. His main utility was brute strength and intimidation through sheer size alone. When you break into someone's house, you want to do it when they're not home, and if they do happen to be home, you want to make sure you're not carrying a weapon. It sounds counterintuitive until you remember that armed burglary can get you life in the jug. Bring a gun with you, and even if you don't get the max, you're still in mandatory minimum territory. Instead, you bring a guy with big shoulders, so a weapon isn't necessary. If it hadn't been for a rotten streak of luck at the mahjong tables and back of Jade Fountain, I probably would never have given in to Lowell's needling. Owing money to a guy like Pete Ha is a hell of a lot better motivator than being called a dumb Okie. I never actually believed the Jules story, to be clear. I just figured anyone who's been around as long as old Lady Kursov must have something worth taking. The plan was simple. A straight smash and grab. Take a crowbar to the door jamb, pop the lock, go shopping. Since I never saw the old lady leave the house, we had to assume she'd be home when it went down. The best we could do was hope that she was hard of hearing, and if that wasn't the case, that Lowell's watermelon-sized biceps would be enough to convince her to stay in bed until we were done. We had no way of knowing we'd never even get that far. It had to have been 1 or 2 in the morning when we rolled up on old Lady Kursov's house. Looking at it, that old prickle returned, the knack telling me to stay away. It was cold out, much colder than it had been the night before. Snow clouds hung low in the sky, dusting us both with tiny flakes which melted seconds after landing on our clothes. The heavily shadowed front windows looked more like eyes than ever, I thought, giving the razor-sharp foot-long icicles hanging from the porch the appearance of fangs. Watching Lowell advance on the front door, crowbar in hand, made me nervous in a way I haven't been in a long time. It was about then I noticed the quiet. Ever since we'd gotten out of the car, you could have heard a pin drop. Burlington never gets that quiet. Even if the neighbors have gone to bed, there's still the faraway honking of cars on the freeway, delivery traffic, and midweek drunks driving too carefully on back roads, hoping not to get pulled over. That night, there was none of it. It was as if the whole world were holding its breath. While Lowell was on the porch, I stayed on the sidewalk, keeping an eye on the street. All the while, my sixth sense was ringing every bell it could to keep me a safe distance from the place. With a crunch, the door gave way, and Lowell pushed it open. Before he could enter, the whole thing began to shake as if struck by a very small, specific earthquake. He steadied himself, one hand against the jamb, waiting for the tremors to subside. Instead, they worsened, the floor shaking and rattling. The knack was screaming in my ear to step back, to get as far away from the witch house as possible. Too late. With a terrible grinding of steel and concrete, it began to rise in front of me, foot by foot, revealing that it stood on 2 enormous, bony legs. Lowell was screaming, but it hardly mattered. The enormity of what I was seeing was already beyond my capacity to understand. With a casual backward snap, as if it weighed nothing at all, the house tossed all 250 pounds of him up into the air like a heron would a fish. The last I'd ever see of him was just over the porch's bottom stair, now pointed upward toward the sky. It was his boots, scrambling for purchase in the air before falling out of sight. Lowell's screams faded slowly, as if he was being dropped down a well, until they couldn't be heard anymore. Amid another chorus of creaking and cracking, the witch house tipped back down to face the street. He was gone, and where he had last stood was old Lady Kursov. She had on a nightdress as white as her hair, and her eyes were boring right into mine. As if from nowhere, a vision invaded my mind, one I still have nightmares about more often than I care to admit. Lowell, tumbling forever down a razor-lined throat. With a thin-lipped smile, old Lady Kursov stepped back into the witch house, closing the front door behind her with a gentle click.
Subject, Wilbur Bridge. User, Outlytree. Posted October 19th, 1994.
When you live out in the middle of nowhere, you find ways to amuse yourself. Some of the guys I know like to drink, but me and my buddies have always been into weird stuff like looking for ghosts. Most weekends, a few of us will pile into my wagon and go bombing around the countryside looking for old graveyards or poking around some of the abandoned farms way out past the county line. Some of the places give us a bit of a funny feeling, kind of like heaviness or pressure in the chest, but we haven't actually seen a ghost or anything like that yet. Last weekend, though, we saw something, and now I'm not sure how safe we are. This part of the state is known for covered bridges. We have something like 50 of them within a 2-hour drive of our town, and people come from all over to check them out. As far as I'm concerned, bridges are not particularly interesting, even with a roof on them, but there are a couple of them in the county that give off that heaviness in the chest feeling, including the Wilbury Bridge. Wilbury Bridge is maybe half an hour away from my house on a bumpy old access road, and I find myself drawn there quite a bit. Most of the time with the guys, but sometimes on my own too. Part of the appeal is a weird trick of the light that happens if you stand on the eastern side. There's an old farmhouse on the western side of the river, and when the barn light is on, you can just see it through the trees from the eastern side. At night, the light, branches, and shadows combine in a way that's hard to describe, but I always feel like if I stare at it long enough, I'll be able to see something I shouldn't. If you'd asked me before last weekend exactly what it is I'm expecting to see, I couldn't have told you, and certainly wasn't what appeared in front of us on Saturday. The night started at Andrew's place, then we went over to pick up Chris around 11 after he finished babysitting. None of us wanted to be inside, so we grabbed some snacks from 7-Eleven and hit the back roads. Subconsciously, I think we all knew it was going to be an unusual night. And I know that might not make sense, but we were jittery in a way we've never been before. Way more than can be explained by junk food alone. The sky was clear and full of stars, but as we left downtown, we all agreed that the forest felt darker than usual. We'd seen that before, especially in the heavy places, but this was much more widespread than usual. I wanted to go to Wilbury right away, but had this feeling we shouldn't, at least not yet, so instead we went out to the county line and worked our way backward. The roads around my hometown tend to be quiet at night, but on weekends and some weekdays, you can at least count on seeing the distant flickering light of a bush party. Saturday, though, nada. It was like the night belonged entirely to us. It made us feel safe, and now I wonder if that was the idea. Around 1 a.m., something in the air changed, and I felt like it was the right time to hit up Wilbury Bridge. The heaviness that usually surrounds it extended even further that night. We were a half a mile down the pitted access road when we felt it. But instead of this functioning as a warning, it felt like a challenge, a tease even. The night was so dark and we felt so keyed up that it must mean something was going to happen. We would finally see our ghost. We pulled up to the bridge and pulled over to the side of the road, same as always. We looked through the bridge to see if the barn light was visible through the trees, same as always. Minutes ticked by. A A slight breeze was stirring the trees, but we couldn't hear it inside the car. The only sound we heard was the crinkling of potato chip bags in the back seat as Andrew shuffled his feet. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the pressure in our chests increased until we each found it was a struggle to breathe. Suddenly, it was like a switch flipped in my brain and I realized something was wrong. As I did, they appeared, blocking out the light of the barn. Moving toward us through the swaying tree branches across the creek was a line of hooded figures. I turned the engine over, which jarred the other guys out of the fugue state we'd just been in, and my headlights lit up the bridge. The figures were even closer than I thought, 20 feet away at most. They wore black robes made out of what looked like heavy, coarse cloth, the hoods covering their faces. I didn't know what they wanted, but they were moving toward us, and every instinct in my body told me we had to go. The guys started shouting in my ear, telling me to get us out of there, and I didn't need to be told twice, jamming the transmission into reverse as the first of the hooded men was only feet away from our side of the bridge. My wheels spun in the dirt, and for a second, I didn't think we were going to get out of there, but then they bit, and the car shot backward at speed. I spun the wheel, shifted into drive, and hit the gas, swinging us around and putting the monks behind us. I could see them in my rear view, and they'd stopped moving. As we got further away, I watched them throw back their hoods in unison, and I saw something impossible. White fire burned where their heads should have been. It was only visible for a moment, then I lost sight of them as I burned around a corner, narrowly avoiding a pothole that could have cost us a wheel. After the bridge, we ended up at Big J's Pizza, and it was the strangest thing. Not one of us talked about what happened. We talked about food, girls, anything and everything except the experience we'd all just endured. It was like we were all afraid that to talk about these things was to invoke them or something. I really don't know. What I do know is that since Saturday night, I felt like I'm being watched. It doesn't matter if I'm in a crowd or home alone in my parents' basement, I'll feel a chill up my spine and be completely sure that someone else is there with me. If we were, in truth, being directed toward Wilbury that night, it means something wanted us there. But why? And what does it want with us now?
Fear Daily is an independent podcast hosted by Brandon Schexnayder and written by Brennan Storr, with Joanna Smith serving as the consulting editor, audio production by Rachel Boyd, and sound design by Southern Gothic Media. This podcast is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations, is entirely coincidental. Ad-free versions of Fear Daily are available now on your favorite podcast apps. For more information, visit feardaily.com. But move fast, before the server goes offline.